Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video I'm going to be making a pixel art animation inspired by a scene from the recent Cyberpunk Edgerunners anime series. And you can see I've got a few screenshots from the show just as a reference here. The canvas size I'm using for this work is 240 by 160 pixels. And I've selected that because that's the resolution of the GameBoy Advance. And I just thought something in that kind of fidelity would look really nice for this property. GameBoy Advance pixel art is like secretly some of the best pixel art out there, I think. Or not so secretly really, but it's just interesting because it's from an era that's coming out of the 16-bit generation. So I think there's a lot of refinement in the technique there. But then also to apply that to kind of this smaller handheld resolution is just such a great pairing for me. So yeah, aesthetically, that's kind of what I was going to aim for with this. Although this didn't really start out with the intent of being like a game mock-up specifically, more just some nice pixely looking pixel art based on a fun series that I've been enjoying. As you can tell, I'm working up the train background here to have a bit of perspective to it. One of my initial thoughts was to have everything viewed from kind of a straight on perspective, like just kind of flat so that the background wouldn't actually pull too much focus or anything. But I think for a train car, it's kind of nice that you would have some sense of depth to it. Like to actually see the seats poking out or the little nook of the entrance and things like that. So for everything that I built here, I'm trying to give it that little hint of side view. I think this also works really well for side-scrolling type beat-em-up games because it provides some sort of directionality to like the movement on screen. Like normally, you'd be moving from left to right across the screen, and so having that sort of perspective, maybe in a way, just kind of reinforces that movement and that flow. I've started this by working in grayscale because I just wanted to get a sense of the overall contrast before making it more complex with color. Since this is a background for our characters, I think it would actually be okay that the background is like a little bit washed out if need be, just so the characters can really pop off the screen as the main focus here. So after kind of playing around and getting the contrast in a good spot for now, I'm going to colorize this by adding a gradient map adjustment layer over the top. And what this is going to do is basically just cast colors into the grayscale that's sitting below it. But beyond that, with the gradient map, I can actually select a specific color gradient. So in this case, I'm actually going to go with something in the realm of like a blue to purple. And it's going to give this sort of slight hue shift along all of those tones, just so it's not so monochrome. This is a nice sort of quick application. It's by no means a one-step solution, but I always find that it gets me into a pretty good spot to be able to go in after and kind of play around with the colors to find something that I like. In this case, I end up shifting things around a little and introducing some soft gray tones, as well as pops of yellow for the handrails. And slowly but surely it starts to come together enough, for a background at least. One of the things that really helped quite like elevate this look though was just going in and adding little bits of detailing here and there that kind of start to slowly stack up. Like having sort of these bright edges along everything and also splashing a few bits of random weathering and texture around. What I tried to do was inject a bit more color by making these additions with kind of really like radical color choices, I guess. I did this on my recent Evangelion piece, and I like the look of all these sort of like multicolored highlights. So I was just kind of bringing in that technique into this one as well. Real quick, I can show you a before and after comparison from this detailing step. So basically by just painting over the train with all these kind of random highlights and details and things, there's sort of this nice pop to the background now, some character to it as well. It sort of has this effect of looking more lived in or real in a way, I suppose. So this will do quite well as a backdrop for now. Alright, for the character work, I'm going to start with Lucy because I felt like her design was the more complex of the two, compared to David. So I figured whatever style or level of rendering I'd be using could be established by just trying to get her details right. I'm starting this one as a very rough silhouette and then painting the main color blocking of her outfit over top. And once those blocks are accommodated, I can kind of fine tune everything into place very slowly, and then maybe we'll see where we can land for the overall style. Since there was this underlying inspiration from the Game Boy Advance, some of my aesthetic references tend to include games like Mega Man Zero and Star Wars Episode 3. Not that I'm really aiming for anything that looks directly like either of those games in terms of the sprite work here, but those ones in particular are just always kind of in the back of my mind for what I think of as good examples of a GBA style side-scroller look. For my Edgerunner sprite work, what was really important to me was that the rendering should introduce really vibrant colors for the shading and the line work, since I feel like that would be a nice translation of the kind of hyper-stylized visuals that studio trigger work tends to have. So I've used blue tones for the shading on the white sections, and I've really pushed the purple and the pinks and the blues in both the line work and the shading of the hair. With the Lucy sprite in place, I can now roughen a David sprite that follows the same kind of stylistic cues, which again I start from this silhouette and then I fill that with color. These sprites, by the way, are about 50 pixels tall, which in general is quite a generous amount of room to work with for sprites. But then particularly for these characters, these designs, that also feels just about right for kind of just being able to capture some of the smaller details in their costuming, while still looking, fairly stylized and pixely from a distance. I didn't really put myself into any further restrictions with color count or anything like that, so I just kind of kept introducing new shades of color if I felt like it would help achieve a bit more polish or kind of small levels of detail in the sprite work. The next thing I want to try with the David sprite is just working up a bit of animation, because I wanted to see if I could reproduce a visual effect from the show. Basically what's happening in this scene is that David is kind of pickpocketing, kind of robbing people on the train, and he's able to move very quickly. And the way that this is conveyed is by having this sort of frame by frame multicolored trail of his movement kind of follow along, with him. So to get this started, I'm just rapidly roughing out a bunch of walking poses by continuing to edit the sprite. I just want enough to put together a basic walk cycle and maybe a couple of swiping, grabbing motions to use along the way. And so at this point, I'm keeping the sprite work fairly loose. Pretty sure there's a few gaps in the pixeling in the posture here, just due to all this cutting and pasting while slapping it together. But I really wanted to work up kind of this quick proof of concept for how I can pull off the trail effect. So if we go ahead and put all those frames together, you can see that there's some semblance of a walk cycle here. And then at the end, I've got him turning around, at which point I plan to just maybe mirror the rest of the sprites so that he can be walking back to the center of the train. But for now, this is kind of enough to explore the rest. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to go through the frames one at a time and turn on each of the previous Davids. That way each frame is kind of staying on screen to create the trail effect. Next, I'm going to go to the first frame that'll become the colorized part of the trail. And just like when colorizing the train background, I'm going to add a gradient map and clip it to the David frame. And clipping it just makes sure that it's only affecting that one sprite. I'm going to set this to the color blending mode so that it retains the same contrast as the original sprite work. And then I'm going to choose a color for this. In the show, it starts out as green and kind of shifts its way over to blue and purple. So I'm going to start with something in that region. But the really cool thing here is that if I want to change this color at all, I can just add a hue saturation adjustment layer and slide the hue around to make this into a totally different color. So I think you can see where this is going. Basically, I need to create a pairing of a gradient map and a hue adjustment layer for each David sprite. And then on each frame, shift the individual hues so that they create that rainbow sort of effect along the chain. It's a bit of a repetitive copy-paste job, I suppose, but in the end it approaches something quite reminiscent of what we see in the show. And the great thing too is that these adjustment layers, this method is completely non-destructive. Like if I want to edit the underlying sprite work or pop a different pose into that frame, it's just kind of a simple swap. So eventually I can kind of work this up into the final version using this technique. Okay, before we can call this as good as done though, we need to address a few more presentational improvements. Firstly, since I blocked off a good portion of this artwork in this kind of widescreen letterbox kind of style, I figured I might as well make use of that free space to design a HUD. I felt like it'd be a good way to explore some other fun graphics and also pay a bit of homage not only to GBA games, but also to fold in a bit of identity from the Cyberpunk 2077 game itself. So what I did was I just compiled this mood board of various images from those sorts of properties, and I'm kind of freestyling some mixture that lands partway between all those reference points. I've got to be entirely honest too, I've actually still not had the opportunity to play Cyberpunk 2077. I still got to get some better hardware or something before I'm able to jump into that. So my use of some of the smaller icons and visuals and things are just a bit of a guess, I suppose. But regardless, this is just to support the Edgerunners idea, so I try to think of it in that context also. And the last thing, of course, is to add a few NPCs into the train, because it's feeling quite empty at the moment. Again, I've got some screen caps from the show here, just so I can pull a few that actually appeared during that sequence. And I'm hitting this sort of weird balance where I'm not trying to give them too much detail. I didn't really want them to pull too much attention away from Lucy and David. More so, I just wanted them to exist kind of partway between being a background entity and a main character, if that makes sense. But nevertheless, I'm still using the established sprite color palette just so that they are consistent in that respect. All right, so with that all coming together, let's go ahead and take a look at everything after it's been assembled. Here we go. All right, so it's quite a bit of work getting all that animated synchronization into place, but we got there. One of the last things that I added was this scrolling background behind the train. And that's just different layers that scroll at different rates to give that kind of parallaxing effect, which is always a nice little perspective trick. And we'll go ahead and close out with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.